The elevator to nowhere. In the heart of downtown Chicago, there stood a building known as the Hartman Tower. Once a bustling office building, it had been abandoned for years due to financial troubles and a series of inexplicable incidents that drove away tenants. Despite its derelict state, the building retained an eerie allure, a beacon to thrill seekers and urban explorers. Legends surrounded the Hartman Tower, but none were as pervasive as the tales of its haunted elevator. According to rumors, the elevator would descend to a mysterious and malevolent place, taking unwary riders on a journey from which few returned. The stories were varied. Some claimed it was a portal to another dimension, while others believed it led straight to hell. Whatever the truth, the elevator's reputation was enough to keep most people at bay. Chapter 1: The Dare. One chilly October evening, a group of college friends gathered in a dimly lit dorm room. They were discussing urban legends, and it wasn't long before the Hartman Tower came up. Sam, the de facto leader of the group, was a skeptic who relished the opportunity to debunk myths and legends. "You know it's just a bunch of nonsense," Sam said, dismissing the tales with a wave of his hand. "It's just an old building with a broken elevator. But I bet none of you are brave enough to check it out." His challenge hung in the air, a gauntlet thrown. Emily, Chris, and Jake exchanged uneasy glances. They had heard the stories too, and while they enjoyed a good scare, the Hartman Tower was in a league of its own. "I'll go," Emily said finally, her voice steady. "But only if you guys come with me." After some deliberation, they agreed. They gathered their flashlights, cameras, and a few other supplies, ready to face whatever awaited them in the Hartman Tower. Chapter 2: Entering the Tower. The friends arrived at the Hartman Tower just as night was falling. The building loomed above them, its dark windows like empty eyes staring into their souls. They found a side door that had been pried open, likely by previous explorers, and slipped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of mold and decay permeated the halls. Their flashlights cast long, eerie shadows as they made their way to the central lobby, where the infamous elevator awaited. The elevator doors were partially open, and a faint, sickly light emanated from within. "All right, let's get this over with," Sam said, stepping forward. The others followed, their apprehension growing with each step. Chapter 3: The First Descent. Inside the elevator, the friends found an old-fashioned control panel with a series of worn-out buttons. Most were unmarked, but one stood out, a button with no label, slightly recessed and covered in grime. "That must be it," Chris said, pointing to the button. "The one that starts the ride to wherever it goes." With a deep breath, Sam pressed the button. The elevator doors closed with a groan, and the descent began. At first, everything seemed normal. The elevator moved smoothly, the floor numbers ticking down one by one. But then, the numbers disappeared, replaced by a dark void. The lights flickered, and a deep, unsettling hum filled the air. The friends huddled together, their breaths coming in quick, shallow gasps. Suddenly, the elevator jolted to a stop. The doors slid open, revealing a long, dimly lit corridor that stretched out into darkness. Chapter 4: The First Encounter. Cautiously, they stepped out of the elevator. The air was cold and stale, carrying a faint metallic scent that set their nerves on edge. As they moved down the corridor, they noticed strange markings on the walls, symbols and sigils that seemed to writhe and shift in the dim light. "Do you guys see that?" Jake whispered, pointing to one of the symbols. "It's like it's moving." They pressed on, their footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. They reached a large room filled with rows of old hospital beds, each occupied by a motionless figure covered in a white sheet. "Is this some kind of morgue?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Before anyone could answer, the sheets began to stir. Slowly, the figures sat up, their faces hidden in shadow. The friends backed away, but the figures began to rise, their movements jerky and unnatural. "Run!" Sam shouted, and they bolted back down the corridor, the sound of shuffling footsteps and low moans following them. Chapter 5: The Descent Continues. They reached the elevator and frantically pressed the button. The doors closed just as the first of the figures reached them, its outstretched hand clawing at the air. The elevator resumed its descent, the unsettling hum louder than before. The friends huddled together, shaken but relieved to be away from whatever horror awaited them above. "This is insane," Chris said, his voice shaking. "We need to get out of here." Sam nodded, but before he could respond, the elevator stopped again. This time, the doors opened to reveal a vast, underground cavern. The air was damp and fetid, and the only light came from a series of torches lining the walls. "Where the hell are we?" Emily asked, stepping out of the elevator. They moved cautiously through the cavern, the eerie silence broken only by the occasional drip of water. As they ventured deeper, they came across a large stone altar in the center of the cavern. Strange, dark stains covered its surface, and a sense of dread washed over them. "We need to leave," Sam said, his voice barely above a whisper. Chapter 6: The Ritual Chamber. Before they could turn back, a low, guttural chant filled the air. Figures in dark robes emerged from the shadows, their faces hidden beneath hoods. They surrounded the friends, blocking any escape. One of the robed figures stepped forward, raising a knife above the altar. The chanting grew louder, more frenzied. Sam, Emily, Chris, and Jake were forced to their knees, unable to move or cry out. As the knife descended, the cavern was filled with a blinding light. The robed figures screamed in agony, their forms dissolving into nothingness. The friends were thrown back, the light overwhelming their senses. Chapter 7: The Final Descent. When the light faded, they found themselves back in the elevator. The doors were closed, and the hum was gone. The elevator began to ascend, the floor numbers reappearing. "Did that just happen?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. None of them could answer. The elevator stopped at the ground floor, and the doors opened to the familiar lobby of the Hartman Tower. They stumbled out, the cold night air a welcome relief. Chapter 8: The Aftermath. They left the Hartman Tower in silence, their minds reeling from the night's events. Back at the dorm, they tried to make sense of what had happened, but the memories were hazy, as if shrouded in a fog. The footage they had captured was corrupted, the images distorted and filled with static. It was as if the elevator had erased all evidence of their journey. They vowed never to speak of it again, but the experience left a mark on each of them. They avoided elevators whenever possible, the memory of the Hartman Tower always lurking in the back of their minds. Chapter 9: A New Beginning. Years passed, and the friends went their separate ways. Sam became a journalist, Chris pursued a career in engineering, Jake became a teacher, and Emily became a psychologist. Despite their different paths, they remained connected by the shared experience that had forever altered their lives. Emily, in particular, was haunted by the events of that night. She dedicated her career to studying the human mind, seeking to understand the nature of fear and trauma. Her research led her to explore other paranormal phenomena, but nothing ever came close to the terror of the Hartman Tower. Chapter 10: The Return. On the 10th anniversary of their visit to the Hartman Tower, Emily received an anonymous letter. The envelope was plain, but the contents were anything but ordinary. It contained a single photograph of the Hartman Tower with a message written on the back: "The elevator awaits." Unable to resist the pull of the past, Emily reached out to Sam, Chris, and Jake. Reluctantly, they agreed to return to the Hartman Tower, hoping to find closure once and for all. Chapter 11: The Journey Back. They arrived at the Hartman Tower under the cover of darkness. The building looked more decrepit than ever, its facade crumbling and windows shattered. The air was thick with tension as they made their way inside, their flashlights casting eerie shadows on the walls. The elevator stood waiting, just as they remembered. The doors opened with a creak, and they stepped inside, their hearts pounding with a mix of fear and anticipation. Chapter 12: The Descent into Madness. As the elevator began its descent, the friends braced themselves for whatever horrors awaited. The familiar hum returned, growing louder and more oppressive with each passing moment. The floor numbers disappeared once again, replaced by the same dark void. The elevator stopped, and the doors opened to reveal a scene straight out of a nightmare. They found themselves in a twisted version of the Hartman Tower, the walls warped and covered in dark, pulsating veins. The air was filled with the sound of distant screams and sinister whispers. "Stay close," Sam said, his voice trembling. They moved through the distorted hallways, the atmosphere growing more oppressive with each step. They encountered grotesque creatures and ghostly apparitions, each more terrifying than the last. The line between reality and nightmare blurred, and they struggled to maintain their sanity. Chapter 13: The Heart of Darkness. Their journey led them to the heart of the building, where they found a massive, pulsating entity that seemed to be the source of the malevolence. It was a grotesque amalgamation of flesh and machinery, its presence radiating pure evil. "We have to destroy it," Emily said, her voice resolute. "It's the only way to end this." Using whatever they could find, they attacked the entity, their fear replaced by a fierce determination. The entity fought back, lashing out with tendrils of darkness, but they pressed on, driven by the need to end the nightmare. Chapter 14: The Final Confrontation. The battle was intense, the air filled with the sounds of their struggle and the entity's otherworldly screams. Just when it seemed they would be overwhelmed, a blinding light filled the room. The entity shrieked in agony, its form dissolving into nothingness. The light grew brighter, enveloping them completely. They felt a sense of peace and relief, as if the darkness that had haunted them for so long was finally lifted. Chapter 15: The Aftermath. When the light faded, they found themselves back in the elevator, their clothes torn and covered in soot. The hum was gone, and the floor numbers reappeared. The elevator ascended smoothly, and the doors opened to the ground floor of the Hartman Tower. They stepped out into the night, the cool air a welcome relief. The building behind them seemed different, as if the malevolent presence had been purged. Chapter 16: Moving On. The friends parted ways once more, but this time with a sense of closure. The Hartman Tower and its haunted elevator became a distant memory, a chapter in their lives that had finally been closed. Emily continued her research, her experiences at the Hartman Tower giving her a deeper understanding of the human psyche. Sam wrote a book about their ordeal, sharing their story with the world. Chris and Jake found peace in their respective careers, their bond strengthened by the trials they had faced together. The Hartman Tower remained abandoned, its dark windows watching over the city. The stories of the haunted elevator continued to circulate, growing more elaborate with each retelling. Years later, a new group of thrill-seekers would come across the legends of the Hartman Tower. Drawn by the same morbid curiosity, they would venture inside, unaware of the horrors that awaited them. And so, the cycle continued, the elevator to nowhere forever descending into darkness, taking with it the souls of those who dared to ride.
Don't forget to subscribe.